Bueno, lo primero, doctora Pepperberg, bienvenida a España. Muchísimas gracias por venir tanto a acceder a dar un seminario sobre cognición animal como a esta entrevista.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Siempre me ha parecido un hecho interesante que cuando se investiga cognición animal, los animales parecen mostrar más capacidades cognitivas en el laboratorio de las que muestran en su entorno natural. ¿Esto sucede porque no sabemos evaluar esas capacidades en su entorno natural o porque se desarrollan a través del entrenamiento unas capacidades nuevas?
That's a very complicated question. I think when we watch the animals in the wild, many of the tasks we test in the lab are not needed in the wild. So, for example, when we look at number concepts, in the wild they don't need to know exactly 5. They need to know approximately 5, and that's good enough. When we take them into the lab, we can train them so that they can do exactly 5. And then we see something in the lab we don't see in nature because it's not needed. Think about a primitive tribe. They don't need exact number. But you can take a child from a primitive child, put it into formal education, and the child will do the same number work as any other child. So it's the same thing with the animals. It's not simply that we're training them, which is part of it, but that we're asking them to do things that they don't need in the wild necessarily to the same extent, and that's why we see it more in the laboratory.
Relacionado con lo anterior, ¿cree que la cognición es más un potencial amplio que está dirigido por la ecología y el entorno social, o más bien un listado de atributos que una especie posee, aunque no exprese en todo momento, en todo entorno?
No, this goes into much of the work that my colleagues at Harvard do, where we talk about core concepts. And they're not innate in the sense that they proceed without any input, but they are abilities that seem to be based on what's already in brain structures, and they need input to flower. Okay, and the idea is that you can create more complicated cognitive processes by giving, for example, symbolic representation that will allow the subject, be it a child or an animal, to go somewhat further. But there seems to be a core set of abilities. So, for example, every animal that forages needs to know more versus less. They would not survive otherwise. That's a core thing. But they need experience in looking at different patches to be able to recognize, density. Is a small dense patch better than a wide, different, spread out patch, and be able to learn how to determine which is more versus less, not just by looking at it simply, but by processing the information in there. So it's always a combination of these things.
¿Serán las capacidades cognitivas como contar o calcular conceptos como cero? ¿Son capacidades que deben desarrollarse pero que ya están en la especie, o por el contrario tenemos algún tipo de tabula rasa cognitiva que permite que según el entorno se desarrolle la cognición en un sentido u otro amplio pero con un límite?
The East Coast versus the West Coast is modularity versus massive parallel processing. That's a very different issue. So that many of the West researchers on the East Coast believe that the brain has these centers, and the West Coast, they think of it more as a big integration. And interestingly, what's coming out now are people recognizing that these centers really do exist, but they seem to be hubs of processing. And so you need all the connections to all the other bits of the brain for it to work. So we're looking at more as not as massive parallel processing, but as a big group of centers that process things together. But there are separate hubs that if you damage that hub, you will damage the place where most of that processing occurs. But it needs all the connections to the other bits of the brain. So things are beginning to get a little bit less polarized.
Al ver los vídeos de Alex y compararlos con otros loros que forman parte del equipo actualmente, como Griffin o como Arthur, da un poco la impresión de que Alex se sentía más parte del equipo humano de la investigación que del equipo aviar. ¿Cree que la relación social y afectiva que establecen los animales con los entrenadores y cuidadores pueden determinar el desarrollo cognitivo e incluso las aspiraciones de desarrollo cognitivo para poder relacionarse mejor con estos cuidadores?
Yes, it's very important to have this very close relationship to the animals. And this is a big conflict in science, because there is an argument that if you have a close social relationship, you can't be objective in the studies. And it's the same thing with a good teacher of young children. They have to have a good social relationship with the child. This doesn't mean that they treat the child as though it were their personal child. Okay, there is a certain distance, but you treat the animal, the child, as a colleague in learning, and you have to do it that way. So that's what we try to do in the lab, is not treat them like our little babies, but treat them like colleagues in learning. And this is very, very important in getting them to work with us, to be willing to engage in the tasks, and to be able to teach them how to do them.
La lista de capacidades cognitivas que normalmente se investigan, ¿sabes?, es una serie de categorías convencionales que hemos determinado pues para poder reducir la cognición a un análisis concreto y exacto. Pero en realidad todos son partes de una máquina cognitiva más amplia, de un potencial cognitivo del animal. Entonces, esta reducción a categoría no introduce finalmente un sesgo en la investigación que puede estar limitando nuestra capacidad de reconocer capacidades cognitivas nuevas y específicas de cada animal?
Interesting question. I think one of the issues is that if you look at the developmental studies in children, again, I make all these parallels with children, that we are beginning to look at more and more different types of cognitive skills. And then when we see what's being done in the child developmental area, we start adapting these for work with the animals. So I don't think we're limiting ourselves in any way, because we are constantly broadening the basis of the types of skills we're studying.
¿No resulta sorprendente y un poco molesto para los investigadores que estáis centrados en la investigación animal que desde la investigación más conductista no exista prácticamente ninguna capacidad prospectiva sobre qué nuevas cosas, sobre qué nuevas habilidades puede aprender un animal, pero en cuanto se realiza una investigación cognitiva, un experimento que demuestra alguna capacidad o aprendizaje inaudito, sorprendente, se lancen a replicarlo con técnicas operantes para poder después decir que se puede conseguir con contingencias, que no es necesario apelar a mentalismos cuando no son capaces de realizar esa labor prospectiva inicial para encontrar esa habilidad, para entrenar esa capacidad?
This is a very sore point, yes. I think the issue is that it's the idea of mathematical modeling. Yes, you can take any behavior you want and mathematically model it in some way. And this is, again, what many of the behaviorists do. And they will come up with these very complicated chains of behavior and explanations. And if that makes them happy, that's fine. I know that sounds a little bit glib, but that's the only way they can understand it and deal with it. That's fine. That doesn't mean that I have to agree with them. And we do get into a certain amount of discussion at conferences about this. I just don't, there's a certain Occam's razor about cognitive processing where you just say, hey, the brain does this and it makes the connections and it doesn't have to make them through 27 steps, which is what I prefer. But again, I have colleagues who can't deal with that, and if they're very happy in making all these models, but I just don't see it I just don't see that that's really the way our brains work. I mean, certainly there are certain behaviors that are clearly associationist, and that those are very good explanations for. And I will never argue that there's nothing to their work. I mean, there's certain things where you do make these associations. If you think about a lemon, your mouth starts to water. I mean, it happens. It just is there. And there's no cognitive processing that you can explain about that. That's a really pure association. And there are a lot of things in the world that are like that, and I won't argue against it. But I think, again, when you start thinking about conceptual understanding, it's a much more effective way to look at it from cognitive processing.
Y además, con respecto a estos experimentos de replicación y desde laboratorios conductistas, también no puede suceder, y de hecho no sucede, que el historial experimental de cada animal, de cada individuo al que se somete a experimentación, a un entrenamiento para comprobar algo, que todo su historial determine un poco cómo se ha construido su máquina cognitiva, y entonces pues se convierta un poco en una profecía autocumplida el que un animal que siempre ha aprendido por asociación tiende a preferir o tiende a ser capaz de aprender por asociación y no de aprender a través de procesos más complejos. ¿Sabes? Entonces, bueno, pues realmente esto haría que el historial de aprendizaje de los diferentes animales sesgase los resultados de replicación del experimento cognitivo.
I mean, you're trained in certain ways. And if you want to go outside your training, you have to make a big effort to do so. And people who are trained in the behaviorist standpoint don't really want to step out of that. And honestly, those in the cognitive processing really don't want to step out of that. And depending on, again, what you are training, one may be a better process than the other. And the issue is to understand how these things should work together. There are certain aspects, I don't know so much about dog training, but with parrot training. So to get a bird to climb on your hand, you can't model it with a single bird. It is a matter of a behavioristic clicker type training. You come on my hand, you'll get a nut. And that's the way you kind of have to do it initially, or you'll get good birdie, or something that will be rewarding, even if not a food, but something pleasant. Okay? But to train a concept of bigger or smaller that will extend beyond the training paradigm, you cannot do it with clicker training. And that's one of the problems that we see when we look at the animal literature and they train their animals this way. The animals don't transfer very well because they learn it in a very specific context. That's what's going to make the food hopper open up. And then when you ask them to transfer it, it doesn't happen. I mean, one example I give my students is that and this has not happened for many, many years, but in early studies, for example, they wanted to teach a pigeon darker than. So they gave it, a white and a gray stimuli, and the animal was rewarded for hitting gray. So the idea is they learned darker than. Then they gave him a transfer to black, gray versus black. And the animal kept hitting gray because that's what had made the hopper open up. And it took many, many trials for the animal to understand the new idea. And even then it might not have understood darker than. It just knew, with white and gray, you hit gray, and with gray and black, you hit black, but they might not have understood the concept of darker than. Okay, and that's the kind of data you get when you just train that type of ability. So if you're training it in a cognitive process, you give many examples of darker than in the training, so the animal sees can derive the concept that you're getting at, and then it can transfer to anything.
Teniendo en cuenta que la cognición parece construirse de manera más compleja en la diversidad de estímulos, en la diversidad de situaciones, en las interacciones sociales complejas, ¿qué nos aporta hoy día la investigación con animales deprivados y con contextos de enseñanza y de experimentación asépticos y empobrecidos? ¿Qué nos puede traer cuando además parece tener una menor capacidad prospectiva sobre nuevas capacidades de los animales?
You know, having just come from a conference in the States where half of us were doing the sort of behavioristic work and the other half of us were doing much more cognitive processing type work. Again, I think there can be certain aspects that you can learn from the Skinnerians. I don't want to say that everything they do is wrong. There are certain things you can really learn from it. And I think the issues have to do with understanding that some of the techniques need to be adapted. So, for example, again, when I talk to my students, I talk about, starving an animal to 80% of its normal body weight so it will work. Think of how you feel when you miss lunch. There's actually, people are doing studies now showing that the glucose levels in the brain are so low when they do that the animal has trouble, really processing it at the level that it should be able to process. But I think there's some basic ideas that we can learn, and I think that if we use those as starting points sometimes for our studies in cognitive processing, sometimes they will come up with an idea of an interesting topic, and we learn certain things from it. I think it helps. I know that when my students and I read their papers, we get ideas of how to do the experiments in different ways, and then we can contrast, and that's another thing that's very important, that you can contrast the kinds of results you get. So, personally, I would prefer that people do more of the, ecological and ethological and cognitive type studies. I think you do learn more, but that's not to say you can't learn anything from a Skinnerian type of task.
El tema es que esos estudios no introducen, al ser además al reproducir siempre unas mismas condiciones, no pueden introducir un sesgo consistente que haga que los resultados sean concordantes entre sí, pero sí sesgados y parciales.
That in itself is something that we've been studying in the lab quite a bit recently, the idea of how initial conditions affect the results. It's just so incredibly important. And what the behaviorists tend to forget, that the absence of a lot of stimuli is in itself an initial condition. And they don't take that into effect. When you look at things in a more complex way, you start realizing how important these other social effects are. I say again, if you want to see how a small child will blossom, you don't take all the stimuli away and only test it in a Skinner box. You put it in Head Start and you give it, that's what we call preschool in the States. You give it the most enriched possible environment with as many different things to stimulate its brain. And so yes, and we're, even in simple types of tasks, we've found, in a couple of studies recently, that initial conditions are so critically important. So even among the cognitive people, my colleagues in Austria did a beautiful study on exclusion. I will be talking about this in the conference, and it's with gray parrots, and it was the idea of, knowing that there's showing them that, there's 2 treats under 2 cups, and 1 treat is taken away, and then can you figure out where the other treat is? So you're reasoning by exclusion, by ruling out possibilities. And they use the same color cups, and very few of their birds succeeded. We used 2 different colored cups, and all of our birds succeeded. And the difference is that for a flighted bird and a fruit-eating bird, color is very important, and it gives them a way of remembering where things are, whereas spatial, right-left, which if the cups are the same color, is what you're doing. You're testing a spatial right-left task. For a bird that flies, it comes in this way, it comes in that way. Right-left is less important. So again, it's just initial conditions that make a difference on whether the animal succeeds or not, or to the numbers of animals that can succeed. Obviously, the bird that figured it out with the more difficult conditions had, really figured it out. But again, that wasn't the specific task. They were testing 2 levels of cognitive processing instead of only 1. So again, these initial conditions are very important.
Ya desde Gantt, o sea, desde el aprendizaje asociativo casi más antiguo, sabemos que en los perros, y parece que también en los loros grises, existe el efecto persona, que hace que el experimentador que esté con el perro, según sea la relación, influya en la conducta del animal. Por eso normalmente no son animales preferidos los loros y los perros para experimentación conductista. ¿Cómo puede afectar a un animal que se vincula con su entrenador, con la persona con la que está trabajando? ¿Cómo puede afectar a sus capacidades cognitivas o a la medición, de estas capacidades cognitivas, la actitud que tenga el experimentador o el personal de manejo durante el experimento?
I think this goes back to the question earlier, that you can maintain a close social relationship and maintain your objectivity if you are very aware of the implications of what you are doing. So you use certain techniques that other people, that the behaviorists kind of use. So you have, if I'm working with the bird and questioning it, and the bird answers, somebody else codes whether the bird has been correct or not. So their objective is to what they hear. They don't know what I'm showing the bird. So I would say, what's this? The bird says something. They don't know what I've shown the bird. And they repeat what they heard the bird say. So if the bird says something like, green, and I think it's green because I'm showing him something green, but they hear it as 3 because they don't know what I'm showing it, it's an objective response, and I'm not influencing the results. I mean, we're very careful about avoiding cueing and all these other aspects that the behaviorists say that you can only do by putting them in a box, and that's not true. But you have to be very aware of what you are doing and being very careful. And yes, it's easier to throw them in a box, but if you're aware of what you're doing, you can still keep the experimental control.
Enlazando un poco ya el trabajo experimental, aunque todavía no entremos plenamente en el entrenamiento, con el entrenamiento, si podría ser nocivo a nivel emocional para un animal que una persona con la que está vinculado, por la que siente afecto, podríamos decir su persona de referencia, estando presente y a la vista del animal, no interactuase de ninguna manera con él durante el entrenamiento.
This goes down to the very basics of how you're trying to get the animal to learn something. And with behaviorists, the animal has to figure out what the question is, first of all, and then try to solve it. And it's not an efficient way of training. I mean, when we work with the birds, we show them what we want them to learn. And that's the most efficient way of teaching them. And then the idea is to see if they've learned it. You develop a complicated transfer test to see if they can transfer it to a slightly different modality or area or something, and that's how you test them. if somebody wants to teach me something, they don't just put me in front of the computer and let me bang buttons until I figure it out. I mean, if I want to learn how to play tennis, I get somebody who's literally holding my hand in the right direction. If I don't know how my computer's working, I want to watch how somebody solves the problem so I can solve it myself the next time. This is one of the really basic differences. And I just can't understand myself why one would make it so difficult for the subject by doing this in the way that the behaviorists do it.
Habíamos comentado el experimento en que los loros tenían una nuez colgando al final de una cuerda y aquellos que hablaban solicitaban ayuda al entrenador, mientras que los que no hablaban pues intentaban solventarlo, lo solventaban en algunos casos, en otros extinguían la conducta. Esto nos muestra que al tener una comunicación bilateral cambia el proceso de aprendizaje y cambia la relación entre investigador en este caso o entrenador y el animal.
Well, I think the interesting thing is that the untrained animal did the physical task. The trained animal was trying to manipulate the human into doing the task. And I think that's a more complicated level of cognitive processing, although if you just said it, whether the task was done or not, you'd say that the speaking animals failed and the non-speaking ones succeeded. But the speaking ones did something much more complicated and interesting.
Sucede que al elegir un animal concreto, pues como Alex, como Griffin para la experimentación, podríamos dar por casualidad con un individuo particularmente capaz, un Albert Einstein de los loros, o con un individuo muy tonto, un individuo con menos capacidades que la media. ¿Qué es lo más justo cuando se consigue un resultado experimental? ¿Decir que lo obtenido es lo mínimo que puede realizar la especie, son las capacidades mínimas, o que son las capacidades máximas a las que puede llegar la especie? ¿Qué resulta más adecuado?
Oh, I think it's the same thing of saying that the human species is capable of making incredible music because there is a Beethoven, or that they can do incredible artwork because there was a Michelangelo or a Picasso. I can't do that, but the human race is possible because those people have done these things. Or that Einstein solved these complicated equations. I was studying that work at one point, but I'm no Einstein. But we would say that humans are capable of these things because of those abilities, and I think that's the same thing with any animal. That if an animal can do this, then it says the species is capable of doing it.
Tomando en consideración esto, ¿cuáles son los riesgos que se introducen en la investigación al trabajar sobre pocos individuos de cada especie que además tienen un historial de aprendizaje notable? ¿Existe algún tipo de riesgo que pueda sesgar los resultados?
It's a problem. I mean, if Alex had been a real dud, I wouldn't be here. And I've had two birds in the lab that one was ADHD, attention hyperactive disabled. Another one I didn't know but had been abused before I got it. And we spent numbers of years working with these birds until it became clear that these were issues. The ADHD didn't really show up until puberty. So, but it's an important thing to know that these things exist in these birds. All the birds I've gotten have just been by chance, and they have different personalities. And Arthur never really talked, but he was really good at doing these physical tasks. So that's what we did with him. We worked to his strength. That all being said, I don't think Alex was a particular Einstein. I think he had amazing training that none of my other birds have experienced. We are trying to replicate it as much as we can with the new baby, but it's hard because we can't focus only on her. We have Griffin in the lab too. So, Alex had a completely unique training experience.